My name is Orlando, and if you had asked me 3 months ago what the most exciting thing in my neighborhood was, I probably would have said the old ice cream truck that still drove around every Friday. That was before Fabian moved in next door. The first thing I noticed wasn't the sheriff's SUV parked in the driveway. It wasn't the uniform either. It was the fact that every single person on our street suddenly found a reason to be outside. Mrs. Reynolds watered her flowers 3 times a day. Mr. Harris suddenly started washing his truck every evening. Even my 80-year-old neighbor across the street somehow found the energy to walk his dog 6 times a day. I understood. Because Fabian looked nothing like the sheriff I had imagined. He was probably in his mid-30s, maybe older, maybe younger. Tall, broad shoulders, dark hair that was always slightly messy. He had this permanent 5 o'clock shadow that somehow made the uniform look even better. The first time I saw him, he was unloading boxes from the moving truck while wearing jeans and a gray t-shirt. I nearly dropped my groceries. My friend Daniel, who happened to be helping me carry bags inside, noticed immediately. "You're staring." "I'm not." "You absolutely are." I rolled my eyes. "He's attractive. I'm allowed to look." Daniel laughed. "You know he's the new sheriff, right?" That somehow makes it worse. Because it did. Small town sheriffs usually weren't my type. Actually, correction. Straight men who looked like they belonged on the cover of a men's magazine definitely were my type. They just weren't available. I lived alone in the small house I'd inherited from my grandmother 2 years earlier. I worked remotely for a marketing company, which meant most of my days consisted of coffee, emails, and talking to people through a computer screen. My life was comfortable, predictable, and kind of boring. Fabian's arrival changed that almost immediately. The second morning after he moved in, I walked outside to grab my mail and found him kneeling beside his front porch. His dog sat next to him. The dog noticed me first, a massive German shepherd. He immediately trotted toward me. "Oh no, Duke!" Fabian stood up. The dog reached me anyway, tail wagging hard enough to shake his entire body. I laughed despite myself. "It's okay." Fabian walked over, looking slightly embarrassed. "Sorry. He thinks everyone belongs to him." The dog sat directly on my shoes. I reached down to pet him. "Same." That made Fabian laugh. And God, his laugh. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, it was just warm. "I'm Fabian." "Orlando?" He nodded. "Neighbor? Sheriff?" He smiled slightly. "Unfortunately." I raised an eyebrow. "Not a fan?" "It's paperwork and meetings 90% of the time." Duke leaned harder against my leg. Fabian shook his head. "Traitor." The dog ignored him completely. That should have been the end of our conversation. Instead, we stood there for another 20 minutes talking about dogs, moving, the neighborhood, and why our town somehow managed to have 4 pizza places despite only having 8,000 people. When I finally went back inside, I realized I was smiling, which was dangerous, because men like Fabian always came with complications, especially in small towns, especially when they wore a wedding ring. I noticed it halfway through our conversation. Simple silver band, married. Of course he was. That should have solved the problem immediately. Except a week later, I noticed the ring was gone, and I hated myself for noticing. Life next door settled into a strange routine. Fabian left early every morning, usually before 7. I'd see him walking Duke before work, coffee in one hand, leash in the other. Sometimes we'd talk, sometimes we'd simply wave, but gradually those conversations became longer. He learned I drank entirely too much coffee. I learned he made terrible pancakes. He learned I hated running. I learned he apparently ran 5 miles every morning because he was insane. One Saturday afternoon, I was standing on a ladder trying to clean my gutters. Bad idea. Terrible idea, honestly. I hate heights. I was trying not to look down when I heard a voice. "That seems safe." I nearly fell. Fabian stood below me wearing gym shorts and holding a bottle of water. I grabbed the ladder. "Sorry." "You can't sneak up on people when they're 10 feet in the air." He looked up. "You shaking?" "No." "You are." I was. He walked closer. "Come down." "I'm fine." "Orlando." The way he said my name made my stomach tighten slightly. "I've got it." You hate heights, don't you? I sighed. How do you know that? You've been standing in the same spot for 5 minutes. That was unfortunately true. I carefully climbed down. The second my feet touched the ground, I exhaled. Fabian looked amused. You really hate heights. I really do. He reached for the ladder. I'll do it. You don't have to. I know. And before I could argue, he climbed up effortlessly. I watched him work, mostly because it would have been weird not to. Mostly. His t-shirt stretched across his shoulders every time he reached upward. His arms flexed. His hair kept falling into his eyes. I looked away. Immediately. Because this was exactly the kind of crush that ended badly. My last relationship had ended almost a year earlier. Since then, I'd promised myself I wouldn't fall for unavailable men. Especially straight ones. Especially neighbors. Especially sheriffs. Fabian climbed down 20 minutes later. Done. Thanks. No problem. He handed me the ladder. Then he hesitated. It was brief, almost unnoticeable. You busy tonight? My heart did something incredibly stupid. Why? He shrugged. I was making dinner. I blinked. Oh, and I accidentally bought enough food for 6 people. I smiled. That's a very specific accident. He laughed. Okay, fine. Duke likes you, and apparently that means I have to invite you over. I looked at the dog sitting beside him. Duke barked once. See? Fabian said. Peer pressure. I should have said no. Not because anything was wrong, because everything felt a little too easy, too comfortable. And comfort is dangerous when you already find your neighbor attractive. But instead, I heard myself say, What time? Fabian smiled. 7? 7 works. He nodded. And for some reason, as he walked back toward his house, I noticed something again. No wedding ring. Not today. Not this week. Not ever. And for the first time since he moved in, I found myself wondering something I probably shouldn't have been wondering at all. Because maybe the new sheriff next door wasn't exactly who everyone thought he was. And maybe I wasn't the only one noticing things. I spent way too much time deciding what to wear. That's probably the first sign that I was already in trouble. It wasn't a date. I repeated that to myself at least 20 times while standing in front of my closet. Neighbors had dinner together. Normal people invited other normal people over for food. That was all this was. Still, I changed shirts twice. At exactly 7, Duke was already waiting for me on the front porch when I walked over. The moment he saw me, his tail started wagging hard enough to shake his entire body. Well, at least one of us is excited, Fabian said from inside. The house still looked half unpacked. Boxes sat against the walls. A few picture frames leaned against furniture that clearly hadn't found permanent places yet. But it felt comfortable. Warm. It smelled like garlic, grilled chicken, and something spicy. You cook? I asked. Fabian looked offended. I'll have you know I make 3 entire meals. 3? Chicken? Pasta? Tacos? And everything else? I call for help. I laughed. The sound seemed to relax him. For some reason, I'd assumed Fabian would be more serious. He was the sheriff, the authority figure, the guy everyone in town suddenly straightened up around. But here, inside his own house, he seemed different, less guarded. He handed me a beer. So tell me something. About? You've lived here your whole life? Pretty much, he nodded. And you never left? I did for college. Moved back after my grandmother died. His expression softened. I'm sorry. It's okay. It was a few years ago. He looked around the house. Funny thing is, I think she would have liked you. Me? She trusted people with dogs. Duke barked from the kitchen. Fabian pointed. See? I'm already approved. Dinner itself was surprisingly easy. We talked about everything. Terrible jobs, bad relationships, college stories, the strange people who lived in our town. At one point, Fabian told me about arresting a man who had called the police because someone had stolen his garden gnome. The gnome was in his garage. I nearly choked laughing. You're kidding. I wish. And that's 90% of being sheriff? Pretty much. His smile faded slightly. The other 10% is rough. I didn't ask. Something in his voice told me not to. Instead, we cleaned the dishes together. Or rather, I washed while he dried. It felt strangely domestic, dangerously domestic. At one point, our hands brushed while reaching for the same plate. Neither of us moved immediately. Just a second. Maybe less, but enough. Fabian looked at me. I looked at him. And then Duke barked at absolutely nothing. We both jumped. Fabian laughed. Saved by the dog, I swallowed. Apparently. The moment passed. Mostly. Over the next few weeks, dinners became normal. Sometimes at his house, sometimes at mine. Duke eventually stopped pretending he belonged to Fabian and fully adopted me. The town started noticing. Small towns always notice. Mrs. Reynolds asked if we were seeing each other. The grocery store cashier smiled at us one afternoon after we accidentally showed up together. Even Daniel, my best friend, noticed. He sat across from me at a coffee shop one Saturday. You like him? I nearly spilled my drink. No. Orlando. He's my neighbor. He is your extremely attractive sheriff neighbor. I sighed. He seems straight. Daniel leaned back. You know, every time you say that, you sound like you're trying to convince yourself. I saw a wedding ring. Past tense. That shut me up. Because he wasn't wrong. The ring had disappeared, and I'd noticed. Way too much. Maybe he's divorced. Maybe. Maybe he's straight. Also maybe. Daniel smiled. But maybe he keeps inviting you over because he likes spending time with you. I looked down at my coffee. That possibility had become increasingly difficult to ignore. Because Fabian called, texted, checked in. One afternoon he brought me lunch because I mentioned I was buried in work. Another time he fixed my broken porch light without being asked. And every evening somehow we ended up talking. Sometimes for 10 minutes, sometimes for hours. The line between neighbors and friends had started to blur, and that terrified me, because I couldn't tell where Fabian stood. At all. Everything changed one Friday night. A storm had rolled into town, heavy rain, thunder, the kind that rattled windows. Around 9, my power went out. I cursed quietly. The entire house went dark. A minute later, my phone buzzed. Fabian, you okay? I smiled. No power. 3 dots appeared. Come next door. Mine's still on. I hesitated, mostly because my heart had started beating faster for absolutely no reason. Then another message. Duke refuses to relax until he sees you. That made me laugh. 10 minutes later, I was sitting on Fabian's couch while rain hammered the windows. Duke had placed his head directly in my lap. The television played quietly in the background. Neither of us was really watching it. The room felt different tonight. Smaller somehow. The storm made everything outside disappear. I felt like the entire world had shrunk down to this house, this couch, this moment. Fabian sat beside me, not touching, but close, very close. Thunder shook the windows. Duke jumped. I laughed. Fabian smiled. He hates storms. So do I. He looked over. You do? Not storms themselves? What then? I shrugged. Being alone during them. His expression changed slightly, softer. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The television continued playing something neither of us cared about. Rain poured outside, and then Fabian said something quietly. So do I. I turned toward him. He wasn't looking at me. He was staring at the storm. His jaw was tight, his hands rested together. He suddenly looked tired. Not physically, emotionally. Everything okay? I asked. He was quiet for several seconds, long enough that I thought he might not answer. Finally. My wife left 2 years ago. I froze. Not because I was surprised, because I wasn't. I had suspected. But hearing him say it felt different. I'm sorry. He nodded. She met someone else. I didn't know what to say. He laughed softly. Worst part is, I think we both knew it was over long before that. The rain filled the silence. Fabian looked down. We spent years pretending we were people we weren't. My chest tightened. Something about the way he said it. People we weren't. His voice sounded careful, measured, as if every word mattered. I looked at him. He finally met my eyes. And for the first time since I'd known him, Fabian looked nervous. Actually nervous. The sheriff, the confident neighbor, the man who never seemed shaken by anything. And somehow that made my own heart start pounding. Because suddenly it felt like we weren't talking about his marriage anymore, and I wasn't entirely sure what he was trying to tell me. Fabian didn't look away. That was the first thing I noticed. Most people do when conversations become too personal. They laugh, change the subject, find something else to focus on. Fabian just sat there. The storm outside rattled the windows. Duke had fallen asleep with his head resting against my leg, and suddenly the entire room felt quiet in a way that made my chest tighten. "We were married 12 years, Fabian finally said. I nodded. "That's a long time." "Yeah." He rubbed his thumb against his beer bottle. "We met young, 23. Everyone expected it." "Did you love her?" He smiled sadly. "I did." The answer surprised me. Maybe because I wanted an easier explanation. Maybe because I wanted him to say he had always known something was missing. But life wasn't usually that simple. "She wasn't a bad person," he said. "Neither of us were." "Then what happened?" He was quiet again, and then he said, "We spent years pretending we wanted the same life." Something about that sentence stayed in the room after he spoke it. Pretending. Again. The same word. I swallowed, because I could feel there was more. A lot more. But I wasn't sure if he wanted to say it. And I wasn't sure I wanted to hear it. Not because I didn't want the answer. Because I was afraid of wanting it too much. The television kept playing quietly in the background. Thunder rolled somewhere far away. Fabian finally stood. "I need another beer." "Me too." He disappeared into the kitchen. I sat there trying to slow my heartbeat. Because something had changed. I didn't know what, but I could feel it. The power came back around midnight. I probably should have gone home. Instead, we ended up talking for another hour. The conversation shifted away from marriage and toward easier things. Music, movies, terrible high school jobs. Fabian had once worked at a gas station. I had once dressed as a mascot for a local pizza place. He laughed so hard he nearly spilled his drink. "You wore the costume?" "It paid $14 an hour." "You were a giant slice of pizza." I had bills. At some point I noticed how late it had become. I stood. I should probably go. Fabian looked toward the clock. "Damn." He stood too. The house suddenly felt smaller. The distance between us suddenly felt shorter. Duke followed us to the front door. Rain still fell outside, although lighter now. I reached for my jacket. "Thanks for letting me hide from the storm," he smiled. "Anytime." Neither of us moved. The porch light cast soft shadows across his face. He looked tired again, but not in a bad way. Just open. And then he said quietly, "I'm glad you moved next door." I smiled. "I've lived there 3 years." He laughed. "You know what I mean." I did. That scared me a little, because I felt exactly the same way. "Good night, Fabian." "Good night, Orlando." I walked home in the rain, and for the first time in a very long time, I couldn't stop thinking about someone. The next week felt different, subtle, but different. There were longer looks, longer conversations, silences that somehow felt heavier. One morning I found Fabian sitting on his porch before work, coffee in hand, still wearing sweatpants. He looked exhausted. I walked over. "Everything okay?" He looked up. "Didn't sleep." "Work?" He shook his head. "Just thinking." I sat beside him. The morning air was cool. The neighborhood was still quiet. Duke climbed into my lap immediately. Traitor. Fabian smiled at the dog. He likes you more. He has excellent taste. The smile faded slightly. Can I ask you something? My stomach tightened. Sure. He stared into his coffee. When did you know? I blinked. What? He finally looked at me. When did you know you were gay? Every sound around us seemed to disappear. I felt my pulse immediately, because nobody had ever asked me that question quite like that. Not curious, not judgmental, not casual. It sounded personal. Very personal. I took a breath. 17, maybe. He nodded. Was it difficult? Yeah. He looked away. I continued. My parents eventually accepted it. Some people didn't. Small town. Small town. He smiled slightly. I get that. The silence returned. And then very quietly he asked, Did you ever wish things were different? I looked at him. The question didn't feel like it was about me anymore. Sometimes? He nodded. I think I did. Neither of us spoke after that, because suddenly there was something sitting between us, something neither of us had named, and maybe neither of us were ready to. Friday evening, Daniel came over. The moment he walked inside, he looked at me. What happened? I frowned. What? You look like somebody kissed you. No one kissed me. Yet. I threw a pillow at him. He caught it. Seriously, Orlando, what's going on? I sat down, and for the first time I told someone everything. The dinners, the storm, the questions, the marriage, the way Fabian looked at me sometimes. Daniel listened quietly. When I finished, he leaned back. Oh. What? Oh, he's having a crisis. I stared at him. You think? He asked when you knew you were gay. He could just be curious. Daniel gave me a look. Orlando. I sighed. I don't know. Neither does he. That answer stayed with me, because it felt true. Fabian didn't seem confused exactly. He seemed afraid. And maybe that scared me even more, because feelings are one thing. Real life is another. He was the sheriff. This was a small town. Everyone knew everyone, and whatever was happening between us had suddenly become very real. The next night, there was a knock on my door. I opened it. Fabian stood there, no uniform, just jeans and a dark jacket. He looked nervous. Actually nervous. Hey. Hey. He shoved his hands into his pockets. Want to take a walk? I looked at him. The street behind him was quiet. The stars had finally returned after the storm, and something in his expression made my heart begin beating faster, because Fabian looked like a man who had spent the entire week trying to decide something. And maybe tonight he finally had. I grabbed my jacket. Yeah. His shoulders relaxed slightly. We started walking. Neither of us spoke for almost 5 minutes. The entire town seemed asleep. Streetlights glowed softly. Our footsteps echoed on empty sidewalks. And then Fabian finally said, I've never asked anyone that question before. I knew exactly which question he meant. I looked at him. He kept walking, eyes forward, hands in his pockets. I don't know why I asked you. I swallowed. You don't have to explain. He laughed quietly. I think I do. And for the first time since I'd met him, Fabian looked completely uncertain, which somehow made my own heart hurt. Because whatever he was about to say next, I had a feeling both of our lives were about to become a lot more complicated. We walked all the way to the park before Fabian finally spoke. The town looked completely different at night. Empty streets, closed shops, the occasional porch light glowing in the darkness. Neither of us seemed to be in any hurry. Fabian finally sat on a bench near the baseball field. I sat beside him. The silence between us wasn't uncomfortable anymore. It was just heavy. He rubbed his hands together. When I was 19, he said quietly, I had a friend. I didn't interrupt. He moved away after high school. We stayed close for a while. The way he spoke told me this story mattered. A few months before he left, he kissed me. My heart stopped. The words hung between us. Fabian stared straight ahead. I never told anybody. I couldn't speak. The sheriff, the man next door, the man I'd spent weeks trying not to fall for. And suddenly all those strange conversations made sense. I told myself it didn't mean anything. His voice sounded almost distant. People experiment. People get confused. He laughed quietly. Then I spent 20 years pretending I never thought about it again. The night air suddenly felt colder. I looked at him. Did you? He was quiet. No. The answer came immediately. Too immediately. And somehow that made my chest ache. He continued. I got married, built a career, did everything I was supposed to do. He looked down. And most of the time, I convinced myself I was happy. I didn't know what to say. Because this wasn't a confession. Not exactly. This was a man trying to understand his own life, and maybe realizing he had spent years avoiding certain truths. Fabian finally looked at me. I don't know what any of this means. His honesty hit me harder than anything else, because there was no manipulation, no game, no hidden agenda, just fear. Real fear. I took a breath. You don't have to know. He smiled sadly. Easy for you to say. Not really. He frowned. I looked toward the empty baseball field. When I came out, I wanted answers immediately. I wanted to know exactly who I was. I laughed softly. It turns out nobody really gets that. Fabian listened quietly. You're allowed to be confused. He nodded. Am I allowed to be 42 and confused? Absolutely. That actually made him laugh. A real laugh. And for the first time that night, some of the tension disappeared. We walked home slowly. At one point, our shoulders brushed. Neither of us moved away. The contact lasted maybe 2 seconds, but it felt enormous, because now we both knew. Not everything, but enough. When we reached our houses, Fabian stopped. The porch lights illuminated his face. He looked exhausted, relieved, scared, all at the same time. Thank you. For what? For listening? I smiled. Anytime. His eyes met mine, and for one brief second I thought he might say something else. Instead, he nodded. Good night, Orlando. Good night, Fabian. I barely slept. The next few days were strange, not bad, just different. The wall between us had disappeared, and neither of us quite knew what to do with that. Fabian still came over for coffee. I still walked Duke sometimes. We still had dinner together. But now there was an awareness between us, an understanding. One evening we sat on my back porch watching the sunset. Fabian seemed quieter than usual. You ever regret telling people? I looked at him. About being gay? He nodded. I thought for a moment. No. Never? I regret some people's reactions. He looked down. But not the truth itself. He was silent. The sun slowly disappeared behind the trees. The neighborhood became quiet. Finally he spoke. My wife asked me once. I turned toward him. He stared at the yard. About 10 years ago. My stomach tightened. She asked if I had ever been attracted to a man. The words came out carefully, like they had been locked away for years. What did you say? I said no. His voice cracked slightly. And I think she knew I was lying. The sadness in his face nearly broke my heart, because suddenly I realized something. This wasn't new. Whatever Fabian was feeling now had existed for years, maybe decades. He had simply never allowed himself to look at it. Until now. Until somehow the quiet guy next door had become the one person he trusted enough to tell. That realization terrified me, because my feelings for him had stopped being a crush and started becoming something much more dangerous. Friday night, the town hosted its annual summer festival. Everyone went. Everyone. Food trucks. Live music, children running everywhere, the entire downtown area packed with people. Daniel convinced me to go. Halfway through the evening, I spotted Fabian. He wore jeans and a dark blue shirt, no uniform, no badge, just Fabian. People constantly stopped him, shook his hand, asked questions, wanted pictures with Duke, who had somehow become a local celebrity. At one point, our eyes met across the crowd. He smiled, and my entire chest tightened. Daniel noticed. Oh, you're in trouble. I know. Fabian eventually walked over. You came. I laughed. I live here. Fair point. Daniel introduced himself. Fabian immediately liked him. Of course he did. Everyone liked Daniel. After a while, Daniel excused himself to get food, leaving us alone. The music played somewhere nearby. People danced, children laughed, the entire town seemed happy. Fabian looked around. I've never lived somewhere this small. You'll get used to it. I already have. He looked at me when he said it, and suddenly the noise around us faded slightly. There were so many things I wanted to ask, so many things he probably wanted to say. Instead, he said, "Walk with me." Again. I nodded. Again. We walked away from the crowd, away from the lights, toward the quieter streets near the river. The sounds of the festival became distant. The night air felt cool. At one point, our hands nearly touched. Neither of us acknowledged it. Fabian stopped near the water. The reflection of the festival lights shimmered on the surface. He looked nervous again, and suddenly my heartbeat started climbing, because I recognized that expression now. It was the expression he wore when he was trying to be brave. Orlando. The way he said my name made me look up. His voice had become quieter, more serious. I think I've been lying to myself for a very long time. I couldn't breathe. He looked down, then back at me. And for the first time since we'd met, neither of us looked away. Fabian stood beside the river, with his hands in his pockets. The sounds of the festival felt far away now. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. The water moved quietly beneath the bridge. A cool breeze passed between us, and then Fabian took a breath. I think I've been lying to myself for a very long time. My chest felt tight. Not because I didn't understand, because I did. Too well. He looked down at the water. When I was younger, I convinced myself that certain things were just phases. I stayed quiet. I told myself everyone wondered about things. Everyone questioned things. He laughed softly. Turns out not everyone spends 20 years trying not to think about one kiss. The honesty in his voice hurt, not because it was sad, because it was real. He finally looked at me. I don't know what this makes me. I swallowed. You don't have to figure that out tonight. He smiled slightly. You keep saying that. Because it's true. His eyes stayed on mine. The festival lights reflected softly across the river, and for the first time I could see exactly how nervous he was. The sheriff, the man everyone trusted, the man who never seemed uncertain about anything. And here he was, looking at me like I might have answers. I didn't, but I understood. Have you ever... He stopped. His voice became quieter. Have you ever looked at someone and realized they made you question everything? My heart nearly stopped, because suddenly this conversation wasn't theoretical anymore, and we both knew it. I took a slow breath. Yes. He nodded. His jaw tightened slightly. And what did you do? I looked down. Usually? Nothing. That made him laugh softly. That's not encouraging. No, but it's honest. The silence returned. Not uncomfortable. Just full. And then Fabian said the words that changed everything. I think it's you. I couldn't move. He immediately looked away. I'm sorry. No. His eyes returned to mine. No. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it. No. The word came out barely above a whisper, because I had imagined this moment more than once. and none of those versions prepared me for how vulnerable he looked. He wasn't confessing. He wasn't making promises. He was simply telling the truth, maybe for the first time. I don't know what happens now, he said. Neither do I. His shoulders relaxed slightly. Good. I laughed quietly. That's the best answer I've got. For a moment, neither of us moved. The distance between us felt very small, but neither of us crossed it. Not yet. Because this wasn't just attraction. This was a man rebuilding his understanding of himself, and that required patience. Eventually, Fabian looked toward the festival. We should probably go back. I nodded. Neither of us really wanted to. The walk back felt different. Everything felt different. At one point, our hands brushed. This time, neither of us immediately pulled away. It only lasted a second, but Fabian looked down, then at me. His expression changed. Not fear, wonder. As if even that tiny contact meant more than he expected. Maybe it did. When we reached the festival again, people immediately pulled Fabian away. Questions, conversations, children wanting to pet Duke. I stood nearby watching him. Daniel eventually returned carrying 2 drinks. He looked at me, then at Fabian, then back at me. Oh my God. What? He told you something. I looked away. Daniel's eyes widened. He absolutely told you something. I'm not discussing this here. Orlando. I laughed despite myself. Later. He pointed toward Fabian. The sheriff? I nodded once. Daniel became completely silent, which was how I knew this was serious. Because Daniel was never silent. Later that night, after the festival ended, I sat alone on my porch. My thoughts refused to slow down. Around 11, I heard footsteps. Fabian. He stopped at the edge of the yard. Couldn't sleep? I smiled. You? He shook his head. Duke immediately came toward me. Traitor. Fabian sat beside me on the porch steps. The neighborhood was quiet. Most houses had gone dark. Only distant crickets filled the silence. After several minutes, Fabian spoke. I was terrified. Tonight? He nodded. I almost didn't say anything. I looked at him. I'm glad you did. He took a breath. So am I. The words settled between us. Honest, simple. He looked toward the street. You know what's strange? What? I've dealt with dangerous situations. He smiled slightly. Armed robberies, car accidents, things that actually matter. And? His eyes found mine. I've never been this scared. The vulnerability in his voice made my chest ache, because he truly meant it. And suddenly I understood something. For me, being gay had been part of my life for years. For Fabian, this felt brand new, even if it really wasn't. Even if these feelings had existed for decades. Tonight was the first time he had spoken them aloud. That mattered. A lot. I reached over before I could stop myself. My hand rested gently over his. Just that. Nothing more. Fabian looked down. His breathing changed slightly. His hand remained still beneath mine. Several seconds passed. Long seconds. His fingers slowly turned, carefully, and for the first time he held my hand. The world seemed to become very quiet. No dramatic music, no fireworks, just 2 men sitting on a porch after midnight. One of them terrified, the other trying not to be. Fabian's thumb brushed lightly against my hand. The movement felt hesitant, almost disbelieving. He swallowed. This is new. I smiled softly. That's okay. He looked at our hands, then at me, and the expression on his face nearly broke my heart, because it wasn't excitement, it wasn't passion, it was relief, as if something inside him had finally stopped fighting. We sat like that for a long time, neither of us speaking, neither of us moving. Eventually he stood. It was nearly 1 a.m. He looked exhausted, but lighter. Good night, Orlando. I stood too. Good night. He hesitated. His eyes searched mine. For a moment, I thought he might kiss me. Part of me wanted him to. Another part knew it was too soon. He seemed to realize the same thing. Instead, he squeezed my hand once. Then he walked home. I watched him disappear into his house, and for the first time since Fabian moved in next door, I realized something. I wasn't just falling for him. I already had. The only question now was whether Fabian was ready to let himself fall too. I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Fabian sitting beside me on the porch, looking at our hands like he'd discovered something he'd been searching for his entire life. Maybe he had. The next morning I woke up earlier than usual. Coffee didn't help. Work didn't help. Nothing helped. Around 8, I heard knocking. I opened the door. Fabian stood there. He looked equally exhausted. Duke sat beside him. Morning? Morning. He rubbed the back of his neck. I wasn't sure if this would be weird. I smiled. Me neither. That made him laugh softly. Good, we're both confused. I stepped aside. Coffee? Please? We sat in my kitchen. Sunlight came through the windows. Everything felt strangely normal, which somehow made it feel even more important. Fabian wrapped both hands around his coffee mug. I spent half the night thinking. Dangerous. Extremely. I smiled. He looked at me. I don't regret last night. My chest tightened. Okay. He paused. I need you to understand something. I waited. I've never done this. The honesty in his voice immediately softened something inside me. Not because I needed reassurance, because I realized how difficult all of this was for him. Not the feelings, the permission to have them. I know. He nodded. I don't want to hurt you. That surprised me. Fabian. No, seriously. He looked down. I've spent 42 years being one person. He laughed quietly. Or at least trying to be. He finally met my eyes. And then you move in next door. I couldn't help smiling. Terrible luck. Honestly, maybe the best luck I've had in years. The words stayed between us. Simple. Honest. And suddenly the nervousness between us felt smaller. The following week became something neither of us had expected. We didn't officially call it dating. Neither of us knew what to call it. But we spent almost every evening together. Walks with Duke, dinner, movies, coffee, conversations that somehow lasted hours. And little things started changing. Fabian touched my shoulder while laughing. I rested my head briefly against his during a movie. His hand found mine while we walked one evening. Small things, but each one mattered, because every single one was new for him. One Thursday evening, we sat in his backyard watching Duke chase a tennis ball. Fabian seemed thoughtful. What? He smiled. I keep waiting for this to feel wrong. My heart sank slightly, but he immediately shook his head. It doesn't. He looked toward the sky. That's the strange part. I stayed quiet. All my life I assumed certain things about myself. He laughed softly. And now I'm sitting in my backyard holding another man's hand. He looked down at our hands. His thumb moved gently against mine. And it feels peaceful. The word hit me. Peaceful. Not exciting, not dramatic, not forbidden. Peaceful. Maybe that was what Fabian had been missing all these years. Not passion. Peace. The problem with small towns is that eventually everyone notices everything. And eventually someone asked. It happened at the grocery store, of course it did. Fabian and I stood near the produce section when Mrs. Reynolds appeared. She looked between us, then smiled. Oh, there you boys are. Fabian immediately looked nervous. I saw it instantly. Years of habit, years of caution. Mrs. Reynolds continued. You spend more time together than married couples. Silence. Fabian looked at me. I looked at him. For a second I could actually see him deciding. Fear, uncertainty, then something else. He smiled. We enjoy each other's company. Mrs. Reynolds nodded as if this confirmed something she'd known for weeks. Good. And then she walked away. Fabian stared after her. That's it? I laughed. What did you expect? I don't know. He looked almost stunned. I touched his arm. Most people aren't as scary as we imagine. He nodded slowly. I think I've spent years imagining things. Friday night brought another storm, not as strong as the first one, but enough rain to keep us inside. We sat on his couch, the same room, but everything felt different now. A movie played quietly. Neither of us paid attention. At some point, Duke climbed onto the floor and fell asleep. The house became quiet. Rain tapped softly against the windows. Fabian looked nervous again. That expression had become familiar, because every time he was about to do something new, he looked exactly like this. He turned toward me. Can I ask something? Sure. He took a breath. Have you ever kissed someone who was scared? The question caught me completely off guard. I looked at him. His eyes stayed on mine. He wasn't asking theoretically. And suddenly my heartbeat started climbing. I answered honestly. Yes. He nodded. What did you do? I smiled slightly. I let them decide. Several seconds passed. Fabian looked down, then back up. His voice became very quiet. I think I want to. My chest tightened, not because I hadn't imagined this moment, because I had, many times, but none of those versions included the way Fabian looked right now. Nervous, hopeful, almost vulnerable. I moved a little closer, not enough to decide for him, just enough. His breathing changed, the room became very still, and then Fabian reached for my hand. His fingers trembled slightly. He laughed once. I'm terrible at this. No. He looked at me. You're sure? I nodded, and for several long seconds, neither of us moved, because this wasn't just a first kiss. For Fabian, it was something much larger. A door opening, the truth finally spoken, and he was standing directly in front of it. The rain continued tapping against the windows. The television had long since become background noise. Duke slept on the floor, and Fabian sat beside me looking more nervous than I had ever seen him. His fingers still rested around mine. His thumb moved slowly, almost absent-mindedly. He took a breath. I've imagined this about 100 times this week. I smiled softly. Only 100? He laughed. Okay, maybe more. The sound eased some of the tension between us, but only some, because this moment carried years inside it. Years of questions, years of silence, years of pretending. Fabian looked down. I keep thinking I'm too old to be this scared. You're not. He nodded slightly. I feel like I'm 18. Most people do. His eyes lifted to mine. The room felt very quiet, and then he said something that nearly broke my heart. I don't want to do this wrong. I squeezed his hand. There's no right way. For several seconds, neither of us moved. Then Fabian leaned closer, very slowly, giving me every opportunity to stop him. His eyes searched mine one final time. I nodded once, and he kissed me. It was soft, careful, almost uncertain, as though he couldn't quite believe it was happening. The moment our lips met, I felt his breath catch, not because he pulled away. Because he didn't. He stayed there only a few seconds. Then he leaned back. His eyes were wide. He looked genuinely stunned. I smiled. You okay? He let out a breath. No. I blinked. He laughed softly. I mean, yes. He ran a hand through his hair. Wow. That made me laugh. What? I spent 20 years thinking about something. He looked at me. And it turns out reality is a lot stronger than imagination. My chest tightened, because he wasn't talking about the kiss itself. He was talking about allowing himself to experience it. He looked down, then quietly. I wanted to do that the night of the storm. I felt my heartbeat jump. The first storm? He nodded. I just didn't understand why. I smiled softly. I think you do now. He laughed quietly. I definitely do now. The second kiss happened because neither of us wanted the first one to end the way it had. This time Fabian moved closer immediately, less uncertain, still careful, but no longer afraid. His hand rested against my cheek. Mine settled against his shoulder, and something inside him finally seemed to relax. The tension, the years, the fear, none of it disappeared, but some of it did. When we finally pulled apart, neither of us spoke, because words suddenly seemed unnecessary. Fabian rested his forehead lightly against mine. His breathing remained uneven. So, this is what I've been missing. The words came out quietly, almost to himself. I didn't answer, because I didn't think he expected me to. Later that night, we sat together on the couch. Closer now, his arm around my shoulders, my head resting against him. Outside, the rain finally stopped. Inside, Fabian seemed thoughtful. What are you thinking? He smiled slightly. Honestly? Always. He looked down at our hands. I think I'm grieving. That surprised me. For what? He was quiet. For time. The answer hurt because I understood. Years spent hiding. Years spent afraid. Years spent believing certain parts of himself needed to remain buried. I can't stop thinking about what my life might have looked like. I looked at him. And? He smiled sadly. I think that's dangerous. It can be. He nodded. I don't regret my marriage. The words came carefully. I loved my wife. I loved our life. He took a breath. But I also think I ignored part of myself. I rested my hand against his. You don't have to solve your whole life tonight. He smiled. You really like saying that. Because you keep trying to solve it. He laughed. Fair? Around midnight, I stood to leave. The front door suddenly felt familiar. Very different from the first night I'd walked through it. Fabian followed me. The house was quiet. The porch light glowed softly outside. Neither of us seemed eager for the evening to end. He looked nervous again. I smiled. You're doing that thing. What thing? The nervous thing. He laughed. This is all still very new. I know. He reached for my hand. I'm glad it was you. The words hit me harder than I expected, because he meant them. Every single one. I stepped closer. Our foreheads touched briefly. The world outside remained completely still. Then Fabian spoke quietly. I think I was lonely for a very long time. I swallowed. So was I. He smiled. And for the first time since I'd met him, the sadness behind his eyes seemed smaller. Not gone, just smaller. He kissed me one more time, soft, certain. And when we finally stepped apart, he looked almost peaceful. The same word he had used earlier. Peaceful. I walked home beneath clear skies. The storm had passed, and for the first time in weeks, my mind felt quiet, because Fabian had finally stopped running from himself. And somehow, somewhere between dinners, coffee, storms, and long walks, the new sheriff next door had become something neither of us expected. Not a secret, not a mistake, not confusion, just Fabian. And maybe finally that was enough. 3 weeks after our first kiss, the entire town already seemed to know something had changed. Small towns work that way. Nobody asked directly, but people noticed. Fabian smiled more. I smiled more. We showed up together more often. And somehow, the world didn't end. The biggest surprise was Fabian himself. The man who had spent weeks worrying about every possibility slowly started relaxing. Not all at once, but little by little. One Saturday morning, we were walking Duke through downtown when a deputy from the station stopped beside us. Morning, Sheriff. Fabian nodded. Morning. The deputy looked at me. Orlando. Hey. Then his eyes dropped briefly to our hands. Because at some point during the walk, Fabian had reached for mine. He realized it a second later. I felt him tense. Years of instinct, years of caution. The deputy simply smiled. See you Monday, and walked away. Fabian stood there, staring. That's it? I laughed. You really expect dramatic reactions. He rubbed his forehead. I think I do. I squeezed his hand. Most people just want you to be happy. His eyes met mine, and for the first time, I think he truly believed it. A few days later, Fabian invited me to dinner. Not unusual, except this time he looked strangely nervous. Again. At this point, I had learned that whenever Fabian looked nervous, something important was coming. He cooked, or attempted to. The chicken survived. The vegetables did not. After dinner, we sat on his back porch. The evening was warm. Duke slept beside us. Fabian stared out at the yard for several minutes. Finally, he said, My ex-wife called. I looked at him. Okay. He nodded. We've stayed friendly? That's good. He smiled slightly. I told her. My heart tightened. About us? He nodded. I stayed quiet. His eyes remained on the yard. She was silent for about 10 seconds. I winced, then he laughed. And then she said she wondered if this might happen someday. I blinked. What? He nodded. She told me she thought I spent years trying to become the version of myself that everyone expected. The words settled between us. And she wasn't angry? He shook his head. No. His voice became softer. She said she hoped I stopped apologizing for who I am. I swallowed, because suddenly years of guilt seemed to lift from his shoulders. Maybe not all of it, but enough. He looked at me. I cried. I smiled. I figured. He laughed quietly. I haven't cried in years. You're making up for lost time. Apparently. The real moment happened a month later. The annual town picnic, hundreds of people, families, music, food. The entire community gathered at the park. Fabian had been strangely quiet all morning. I noticed. Of course I noticed. When we arrived, people immediately surrounded him. Questions, conversations, the usual. I gave him space. About an hour later, I stood alone near one of the food trucks. Fabian walked toward me. He looked nervous. Again, I smiled. Should I be concerned? He laughed. Possibly. Before I could ask anything else, he reached for my hand. In public. In the middle of the park. In front of everyone. And this time he didn't hesitate. Didn't pull away. Didn't look around. He simply held my hand. The world didn't stop. Nobody screamed. Nobody cared. A few people smiled. Most continued eating. Children ran past us. Music played. Life continued. Fabian looked almost stunned. I leaned closer. You okay? His eyes looked suspiciously bright. He nodded, then shook his head, then laughed. I spent 42 years being afraid of this. He looked down at our hands. And it's just holding your hand. I squeezed his fingers. Yeah. He smiled. And suddenly I realized something. The brave thing wasn't kissing me. It wasn't admitting his feelings. It wasn't questioning his identity. The bravest thing Fabian had ever done was simply allowing himself to exist honestly. That evening after the picnic ended, we sat on my porch. The same porch where we'd first held hands. The neighborhood was quiet. The sun had almost disappeared. Fabian rested beside me. Duke snored nearby. I have a question. I looked at him. Okay. He seemed nervous one last time, only this time it felt different. Lighter. What are we? I laughed softly. You tell me. He thought about it for several moments. Then he smiled. I think we're two neighbors who made each other's lives complicated. That's true. I think you're the best thing that's happened to me in a very long time. My chest tightened. And? He reached for my hand. And I think I'm falling in love with you. The words were simple. No dramatic speech. No perfect timing. Just honesty. And somehow that made them even more powerful. I looked at him, the man who moved in next door, the sheriff everyone respected, the man who spent years hiding from parts of himself, the man who learned that peace could sometimes arrive in the form of a quiet neighbor with too much coffee and a dog who switched sides immediately. I smiled. I think I already fell. Fabian laughed softly. Then he kissed me. Slow, certain, no fear, no hesitation, only us. And as the evening settled over the neighborhood, the new sheriff who had once moved into the house next door finally stopped trying to become the man everyone expected him to be. He became Fabian. And somehow, in the middle of ordinary days, quiet dinners, storms, and late night conversations, I found exactly what I wasn't looking for. Not excitement, not drama, not fantasy, just someone who finally let himself be seen, and someone who was willing to stay.